All right, best and worst case scenarios for every team in the AFC. And for worst case, we can't do a Kyle Shanahan, Brock. We can't say they don't make it to Sunday. We can't do a Jerry Jones and say they might not be here by the end of the season. That's not an acceptable answer. It might be actually for the Dolphins when we talk about Tua. I'm kidding, but the not acceptable answer for anyone else. So let's start with the Baltimore Ravens here. Brock, what do you got?
Best case scenario is a Super Bowl. Best case scenario is rounding out the top 3 highest rushing seasons in NFL history. Right now, the number 1 best rushing season in NFL history is the 2019 Baltimore Ravens. The number 2 best rushing season ever is last year's Baltimore Ravens. If they can put up rushing numbers that match those 2 years and round out the top 3, it means they were successful. It means they keep their all-star defense fresh all season long. And it means they didn't ask Lamar to play hero ball at any time this year. That is how the Ravens get to a Super Bowl.
You know what, Brock? I have written down 2 things here for best case scenario. Super Bowl, Lamar Jackson hoists the Lombardi Trophy, and Lamar wins the MVP, and Derrick Henry wins the rushing title, and all things finally come to fruition for the Baltimore Ravens. We know how good they are in defense. We know how dangerous they are offensively. But the one thing that we also know about this Tiger here is it's got some stripes, and those stripes are earlier than hoped playoff exits. And my worst case scenario is first round playoff exit for this team. One thing that we've seen in the last calendar year with this team as well is the inconsistency at the kicking position. Okay, Justin Tucker, a guy that we've relied on for so long in the National Football League to win us bets on Sunday and hit field goals for the Baltimore Ravens. He's no longer in the fold. There's a lot of stuff going on in that department, and we'll let other people talk about that, maybe JJ. But they're going to have a new kicker in the building. How does this guy fare in those conditions in one of, if not the toughest division in football to kick? We know how often these games come to one-score games. Let's hope it doesn't come down to the kicking game, but worst-case scenario, first-round playoff exit.
I'm going to take it a step there as well for my worst-case scenario. I have playoff loss, but specifically to Buffalo or Kansas City. What does that mean? It means that they did not go to the Super Bowl. And from a Lamar Jackson conversation, he cannot lose to Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes anymore. He cannot lose to them in the playoffs anymore, right? Obviously, losing to one is proof of the other's greatness. But right now, Lamar's in this tricky situation where you go back to the greatness of Michael Jordan, right? How many careers never reached their mountaintop just because they lived in the same era of Michael Jordan? And you get all these names of fantastic players who will always be thought of as second best behind MJ. And Lamar has plenty of time. He's not an old guy. He plays quarterback. He doesn't take big hits. But if he loses to Pat or Josh Allen again in the playoffs, it's a question of you're now competing for second best. I don't want that for him. I want his legacy to be as great as it possibly can be.
Yeah, I'm right there with you guys that the best case scenario for this team could be all-time sort of stuff. This is a special roster, truly the best in the NFL, in my opinion, from top to bottom in terms of what they have. It could be, the best rushing season of all time with a historically great defense that is a just a steamroller to the number 1 seed in the AFC. But then the worst case scenario is they do just that and go first round exit. And they get bounced either in the divisional round or the championship before making the Super Bowl. That to me is the worst case scenario because I don't see a world where this team misses the playoffs. It would blow my mind if they don't make it at least to the playoffs, just given how much talent's on this roster. But the worst case scenario is that they're just still grasping at straws come playoff time. We're talking about how did they not get it done once again? Let's get to the Pittsburgh Steelers. In the AFC, best case and worst case scenario, Brock.
Best case scenario for the Pittsburgh Steelers is win the AFC North because of what you just brought up. If there is a world where the Ravens don't put it together, if there is a world where their defense gets off to a snail's pace of a start like they have last year, and the Steelers just have it all clicking, they can win the AFC North. I can't see more than that, unfortunately. But I would consider that a success considering how different they look this year. Worst case scenario, Mike Tomlin's first losing season. He has gone 18 years without one. And what it would do to Aaron Rodgers' legacy, to sit there and say under your watch you got Mike Tomlin's first losing season, the tough position it would put Steelers management in, saying, okay, we've always been middle of the pack, but now we're kind of below the middle of the pack. Do we really need to move on? I feel it would present some uncomfortable questions and conversations about quarterback and head coach. So that would be the worst case scenario.
My best case scenario is that this team wins a playoff game with Aaron Rodgers healthy the entire season. There's not a regression physically. Actually, what we saw was progress on a rehabbing Rodgers from last year, who was 40 years old. I wrote him off halfway through the year. I said, he's just, he's done. He's done. He can't do it anymore. And I was wrong. And I lost sight of how quickly you lose the empathy and understanding of what a rehab process is like. And I've never done it as a 40-year-old, especially on a mobility injury. Look, he looked like himself at the end of the year. And I would love to think that this team will finish above 500 and the Mike Tomlin streak stays alive. Now, the worst case scenario is that maybe we do start to see that physical regression this year. And it's not just because of the injury. It's just because he's 41, 42. And in that case, you could be looking at a very, very angry city of Pittsburgh. And just like we saw in New York, they were laughing a lot at Aaron in New York and sad. They would just be angry at Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I don't think we have to go too deep in the worst case scenarios. They're like very obvious for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. We have a 41-year-old Aaron Rodgers. Everyone knows what the worst case scenario is in that regard. But I think the best case scenario, just given what this roster is that this offensive line that's so young, 4 of your 5 starters are within their first 3 seasons in the NFL. And a lot of them are at their first year at their respective positions, or like their first year really getting full-time run there. And you have a back in Caleb Johnson, who is a awesome zone runner. And if you know anything about Arthur Smith and how he's operated his offenses going back to Tennessee, to Atlanta, to now Pittsburgh, he's one of the run heaviest play callers in the NFL. I don't see that changing just because Aaron Rodgers is there. Now, Rodgers is known for like on those, calls where you come to the huddle or you come to the line of scrimmage with a run and a pass option. He's known for, favoring the pass. He's going to do that. So you're going to get a little pass heavier, but it's going to be predicated on that stretch zone running game being effective. So if Caleb Johnson is a problem, that's your best case scenario for the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you get his version of Derrick Henry in that offense, his version of Bijan Robinson in that offense, all of a sudden I could see this working. If you don't, if that running game is what we saw last year in Pittsburgh, I don't see it working with just one DK Metcalf and no other wide receivers really of note or really like a wide receiver 2 on this roster. So the best and worst case scenarios for the Pittsburgh Steelers, they're both pretty evident in my opinion. All right, Cincinnati Bengals. Best and worst case scenario here, Brock.
Best case scenario is the Cincinnati Bengals start the season 3-0. Under head coach Zach Taylor, this team has not cared about the first month of football every year except for one. And that year they went 3-0. They went to the Super Bowl. All right. But under Zach Taylor, they are 4-13-1 from week 1 to week 3. That's not good enough. And it's why they're always in a hole coming down the stretch. We know that around week 7, week 8, this team switches a flip. And they are one of the most dominant offenses in the NFL. They have to care about the start of the season in order to make it where Joe Burrow and everyone else wants them to go. Worst case scenario is defense makes no improvement. Now, defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo is out. Defensive coordinator Al Golden is in. He has a much simpler concept historically than Lou Anarumo. It's less risk. It's more just keep the ball in front of you. Think Jeff Hafley in Green Bay. But as far as personnel is considered, there's not much difference. They're kind of just rolling out the same guys, except you have a rookie defensive end who just put on a helmet, and you have your all-star defensive end, Trey Hendrickson, who just showed up to training camp, and he's angry. So I could absolutely see a world where this defense just doesn't make much improvement. And even with a fast offensive start, the defense just cannot hold their water. So that is best and worst case scenario for Cincinnati.
Man, Cincinnati is just one of those teams that we can't keep our eyes off of, right? I mean, Joe Burrow is so talented. The receivers that they got locked up are just sensational. And that's why I think best case scenario, and you alluded to the fact that they start slowly. I think they do start slowly again. I think that it takes time for that defense to figure out how to, put a Band-Aid on a wound. And then they get really hot, and then they become the team like last year that nobody wants to see in the playoffs. But they finally get enough done to get to the playoffs. I think in the best case, Joe Burrow wins a handful of shootouts in the playoffs, and this team ends up losing in the Super Bowl in my best case scenario. My worst case scenario is that the defense comes along just enough, the offense does their thing, and the kicking game is what costs them games again. We saw it last year with Evan McPherson. That would be the one that we didn't see coming because all eyes are on that defensive side of the football.
Yeah, I think best case scenario for the Bengals is it's difficult for them to just with that defense to make the Super Bowl. It just is going to be. Al Golden's going to have to work some absolute magic. Myles Murphy's going to have to take a massive step forward. There's going to have to be some things that change dramatically for us to say the Bengals are hosting the Lombardi Trophy, 9 months from now. But I do think there's a world where they're like a top 3 offense in the NFL or scoring points in everyone. And they cannot afford to start slow. Like you mentioned, Brock, this year, especially because like 2 of their easiest games in their schedule, which should be their easiest games, easier games, at least on paper, Browns week 1, Jags week 2, you better win those games. If you don't win those games, it immediately gets a lot harder. You go Vikings, Broncos, Lions, Packers, the 3 weeks after that. So if you lose the first 2 games of the season, you have that slow start. And I think a lot of the slow starts have been injury related. Burrow's had the ACL tear, the wrist, the calf. He's had a myriad of injuries. So if they're fully healthy, they're ripping out the gate. They start 2-0. We could talk about AFC North, being contenders there. But if they start 0-2, it's the same story because they are not making the playoffs if they start 0-2 this season, in my opinion. All right, last team here in the North, Cleveland Browns. Best and worst case scenarios here, Kyle.
Someone other than Flacco gets a lot of experience this year. That's the best case scenario for this team. I mean, they invested draft capital into a couple of young men. They acquired Kenny Pickett, Super Bowl champion Kenny Pickett. Look, you got Joe Flacco. Obviously, he's the guy that's most ready. But for the long term and the future of this football team, you're going to want a young quarterback to get some time. And you would ideally like him to beat Joe Flacco in a competition, but seemingly that's not going to happen. The worst case scenario is at the end of the year, they still don't have any plan at the quarterback position. And Joe Flacco has been retired to a retirement community of sorts.
Dude, look at that picture. He just looks, he looks like a coach. That guy does not look like.
Bring your dad to practice day.
You are, dude. Oh my Lord. I'm right there with you. I have the exact same take. I think a lot of Browns fans are going to have the exact same take. And it's just my worst case scenario is Joe Flacco plays the entire season. Because if he plays the entire season, that means he's playing like all right. That means you're going like 8-9. That means you still don't know what the hell you're doing at quarterback long term. That means you're drafting in like the teens. You're not going to get a premium pick out of it. You got the Jags first rounder, but that's probably going to be in the teens or even later as well. So you're not getting your top choice of quarterbacks of the future, and you're not making any noise this season. That to me is worst case scenario. Best case scenario is like Dylan Gabriel, Shedeur Sanders gets back healthy, lights it up in the preseason. They're your week 1 starter. That's it. Like that gives you excitement for the future. That makes this a season worth like really watching if you're a Browns fan closely week in and week out, instead of one where you're basically, this is the ultimate fruits of the Deshaun Watson trade, right? This is where his cap hits have ballooned to a point where they're completely untenable, and trying to keep this roster together for the next 2 years is just going to be very, very difficult.
So Shedeur Sanders will be getting reps in a joint practice today against the Carolina Panthers. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch, man. This is, what do you expect to see from Shedeur Sanders? Maybe that you haven't seen. What did you not see from him on tape in college that you need to see from him in the preseason to say, hey, this guy's got his work boots on every day. He's getting shit done, actually.
Well, preseason, I just want to see the speed that he plays with. It just, you can't have those hold, the Caleb Williams plays we saw last year, not to, bring it back to your boy, but you can't have the sacks that he was known for.
You would do that. And
I just want to see what his arm looks like on an NFL football field, because the ball is slightly different from college to the NFL. guys have sometimes struggled with that in the past. Lamar Jackson made note of that his rookie year and has actually improved a lot from his rookie year on. But you'd be kidding yourself if you said that Shedeur Sanders was anywhere outside of the bottom 10 in terms of NFL starters, in terms of arm strength. So what does it look like on an NFL football field? Is it really untenable in terms of attacking down the football field? That's what I really want to see here early on.